Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, if you're going to do a series on ethics in the modern world, I think you just really can't avoid, given our current world situation, the ethics of war. So I just want to tackle that head on and just leap right into that. But before I do want to remind one more time that I'm doing the class in France. I think there's one spot left. Maybe two if it's a couple, but definitely one spot left. If anybody's interested, you can contact me through my webpage. Thank you to everybody who has signed up. And that will be on the third weekend in May, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So if you're interested, just let me know. I've had some people contact me. I've been in communication with them, but I think we're going to end up with maybe one more spot. But if it's a couple, we can squeeze you and make two. So, ethics of war. So obviously this has been a very lively topic, unfortunately, in our world today. And it's odd how much history repeats itself, I guess. So the ethics of war. And one of the most challenging aspects of understanding war and trying to think about it as an ethical concept is war is pretty much by definition a communal undertaking. And what this means is it's not personal. It really, it has personal effects. And of course, it can have tragic and deadly personal effects. But it really is not about individual decisions, except unless you happen to be the leader of a country or a general or something like that. It really is the armed conflict between two communal powers. In the modern world, we think of these as nation states, and I think, according to international law, only nation states have the right to armed conflict. I think everything else pretty much is a violation of law under most circumstances. But of course, that has very little bearing for most of world history because the nation state is a relatively recent creation. And so there's lots and lots of history of large organized societies going to war with each other. Now, when does something become a war as opposed to, a gang? I don't know. Where is the line? If you look at ancient Greece, there was a lot of, relatively small scale wars between city states. And so, but we tend to think of those as wars. So I'm not sure where the line is for that. But at some point, when you get a sufficiently large number of people, maybe a few thousand going to war with a few thousand other people, we switch that over from being, violence or a mugging, and it becomes war. And so the ethics of this are very fraught, let us say, at best. And again, one of the big problems for the individual trying to think about this is that they aren't about individuals, again, unless you happen to be a dictator or a general or someone who has direct authority over these kinds of things. So the example that sticks in my mind is in, in the fall of 2001, the United States had decided to invade Afghanistan. And a poll came out in the newspaper. I remember right where I was sitting. I was sitting in the courtyard of a cafe called Bread and Roses. And the newspaper said that a recent Gallup poll, 90% in a recent Gallup poll in October of 2001, 90% of the U.S. population favored the invasion of Afghanistan, and 5% thought it was a bad idea. I was firmly among those 5%. And I remember reflecting at great length, and basically I've been reflecting on this question ever since, because I thought, wow, so I'm in a democracy, and so in theory I have some voice in my government. In practice, it turns out that I am in the, overwhelming minority of my society, like 90-5. So just dramatically outvoted by my compatriots. So my commune, the group with which I'm identified, had decided to do something, go to war for what I thought was, which just seemed like a terrible idea. I didn't see exactly why we needed to do that. And B, the history, of course, of invading Afghanistan. If you know anything about history, it's just always been a bad idea to invade Afghanistan. No one has achieved very much there except for to increase the some average of human misery in the world. That didn't seem to be a worthwhile undertaking to me. And of course, 20 years later, we finally exited Afghanistan, having done, not very much at incredible cost in lives and suffering and everything else. And so that sort of arc, which seemed very clear and very obvious to me 20 years ago, did not seem obvious to my compatriots. And here is the communal problem, right? What is one's response? How does one respond to a situation in which the group with which you're associated, whether you choose to or not, decides to do something that you think is, utterly daft and ethically repellent? In this case, shrug your shoulders is what I came up with, because it was so dang popular. It was not a secret war or anything else. It was on the news every night, and people, for a while, of course, it faded over time. But yeah, so 90% to 5, I still think that's extraordinary. And that is one of the problems with the ethics of war, is that it is, because we're individuals in larger communal structures, generally we have very little sway. And so many of our ethical judgments are, personal and, almost third party in that sense. It doesn't mean they're not important. It doesn't mean we can't do things. It just means it's one of the tensions that's always there. And the question of what makes for an ethical war has been around for basically forever. The Mohists in ancient China, this would be about 400 BC, reflected on this. Confucius talks about it, but the Mohists really did talk about this. You have the Islamic jurists of the 9th century pondering this at great length, like what you could do to an infidel versus what you could do to someone who is Dar al-Islam within the House of Islam. The Treaty of Westphalia in Europe is sort of famous for beginning to codify these kinds of issues of what makes for a just or ethical war, or how you're supposed to behave in war. In the European context in the 1600s, and of course today we have all kinds of international laws and all kinds of international treaties that try to regulate and reduce the suffering and misery that seems to necessarily follow in war's wake. And this is sort of, all of these attempts are sort of the legalist position. And I'm generalizing here, but philosophically speaking, there's a school that says, well, you have international rules and agreement and codes, and as long as you follow those, then basically you're okay, right? You're executing a legal war. You're following the rules of international guidelines, and therefore your war is ethical. That if you meet the law, then you're being okay. Your war is fine. Now, of course, you can debate all kinds of things about the limits of law and how, people are always cheating on the law and violating the law. By the way, that's a different question. If you violate the law and going to war, that just means you're just doing whatever you can get away with, which we'll cover in a second. But, if you do follow the law, does that make it okay? And it's easy to be cynical about this. And again, international law and treaties are all complex, and there's loopholes and all this. But notice that this has been a multi-thousand-year drive in human civilization to try and reduce and to contain the suffering and misery and destruction of war. How successful it's been, this is debated by historians, but one has to applaud, I think, the effort, if nothing else, and the attempt to say, can we constrain this? Which is difficult, as of course we're witnessing right now in our world today. But even then, there does seem to be this something of an impact of trying to hold back and unifying people against Russia's aggression in the Ukraine, and just trying to sort of come to an international understanding that this is not okay. And having done that, we're witnessing what happens when many international parties agree that you violated the rules, whether written or unwritten, or the spirit of the law. But in any case, this is the legalist position, which of course easy to debate, and we'll talk more about that. Then you have the pacifist position, which comes in various flavors, but this is the idea that war is never right. Like, it's never okay to kill somebody. There is no reason to ever engage in the killing of another human being or the destruction of their property, except perhaps maybe only in the defense of your own life. But even in the sort of more extreme pacifist mode, is like, no, you just run away, right? That's your job. It's never worthwhile. And the notion here is that if one side doesn't fight, you don't really have a war. If everybody just submits, then and there's no fighting, well, you don't have a war. You might have domination, you might have enslavement, you might have massacre, but war, you don't have war. And that's sort of, again, we'll talk about that. That's the pacifist mode, but this is another line of argument that comes throughout history. One of the most interesting documents on this is the Bhagavad Gita, by the way, and the Mahabharata, where Arjuna is riding into battle, and he's faced with exactly this. And he says, wow, I do not want to kill, and it's his relatives across the way. He says, I don't want to kill my uncles and cousins because I love them and they raised me. And, there's nothing on earth. There's no treasure, no empire, no power, no capacity, no attainment that makes it worthwhile for me to kill them. I will not fight. And the point of the Bhagavad Gita is to convince Arjuna that he is wrong and that, in fact, he should fight and he should kill his relatives. And so it's a very interesting text that it seems to be arguing these sorts of points. And in part, it's a response to the Buddhist tradition, which was very powerful in India at that time and was, of course, very pacifistic. And this seemed to be a threat to kind of the powers that be. And so part of the reasoning of the Bhagavad Gita seems to be an argument against the pacifism of Buddhism and how it's sort of robbing of the system of its capacity to function. But yeah, that's the pacifist argument. It's like, hey, if you don't fight, if one side doesn't fight, you can't have a war. And then a third one, which is usually not talked about too much in philosophy, but is there nonetheless, is to me always embodied by this famous letter. It's in Thucydides, and it's Athens was besieging the city of Miletus, a small city, and they said, look, we've got you outnumbered. We're going to conquer you. So just surrender. Like, we don't want to have to do this. Just surrender. And for whatever reason, the people of Miletus thought that they might be able to hold out or that, someone was going to come to their rescue, but that didn't work out. And so they wrote him a note saying, hey, let's think about this. Let's negotiate. Let's not just surrender and we can come to some kind of terms. And Athens wrote back and said, basically, look, we're going to conquer you, so we're not negotiating. And they said, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And I think of this as just like a chilling incarnation of the theory of kind of might make right. Like, war is simply a test to see if you're mighty enough to make your actions correct. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying this is a clear historical concept that, they say winners write the history books. This is entirely untrue, but there is a certain amount of it that says, oh yeah, if you win, then you must have been right because you defeated your foes. Although, of course, historically speaking, there's very little evidence this is actually true, but, it does give you a certain leg up, as it were, in creating the histories and how you're going to be looked at. And so you look at someone like, Genghis Khan, who slaughtered just countless numbers of people, is still remembered in history, whereas many of the societies that he conquered were lost. And so part of the idea is simply like, look, if you've got the power, you can get away with it. Essentially, there are no morals in war. There is only power. And this would be kind of more, that's not really so much the opposite of the pacifist, it's really the opposite of the legalist position, because the legalist position is saying, like, even if you could get away with something, you shouldn't do it anyway. Like, it's better for everyone, including you, if you will constrain yourself by the rules of law. And the flip side of that is the notion is that if you violate the rules of law, those signatories will automatically form a union to try and defeat you. So it's also a measure of sort of trying to organize ourselves against those sorts of violations. And so, you have different threads of trying to think through the problem of communal violence, right? When massive societies, large societies organize themselves and attack other large societies, is it ever justified? When is it justified? Who gets to decide whether it's justified? Should we just be pacifists? Should we just not fight back? At some point, the classic example here is, of course, in many cases that might have worked. It seemed to work for Gandhi with the British imperial forces in India to a certain extent. But would it have worked with Hitler? It doesn't seem so. It seems like he was just, the Nazis would have been just perfectly happy and did, in fact, do lots of exterminating of defenseless peoples. And so historically, yeah, it's rough to take that line. And again, it's hard to not see lots of opportunity or moments when it really was just the Athenians at Melinas, where someone just thought, oh, I've got the power, I can do what I want, and there's nothing can stop me. This often turns out to be wrong. People have often misjudged this, which also, again, seems to be happening in the Ukraine. Russia's invasion seems to have been an incredible error in judgment and, of course, morals and ethics entirely, but also of judgment. Like they just thought they were powerful enough to do it, and it turns out they were wrong. And then, of course, the legalist notion, which tries to, balance these competing forces out and deter through cooperation and through common agreement. So again, you have this problem of communal violence and how to think of it when your society or other large societies go to war. Another aspect of this, and there are many aspects, of course, incredibly vexed problem, war, is the notion of who's fighting. Now, is it a different kind of battle if it's drafted or conscripted soldiers versus volunteers? And one of the common refrains you'll hear is, well, if, senators had to go and fight, there would never be any wars, right? The notion that elected officials only vote for wars they don't have to fight in. And I see where this concept comes from, right? Like they seem very safe and far away while the wars are being fought by generally younger men, sometimes women, increasingly women, but not any place where the older, often men who vote for these things are in danger of being injured or killed. However, the historical record is perfectly clear on this. Man, in the ancient world and even the, not so ancient world, leaders were perfectly happy and, in fact, eager to get into fights with their armies. I mean, again, the Athenian example is they voted themselves to go to war continuously, even though they knew it was them. I mean, it wasn't to vote in Athens meant you were a citizen. To be a citizen meant pretty much that if there was a war, you're going to go fight. I mean, unless you were above a certain age where you probably weren't going to fight. But even then, everybody participated. I mean, it was sort of a total societal undertaking. And if you weren't going to actually fight, then you were going to spend a lot of the resources of the city doing this. And the Greek city-states just fought continuously, even though many of them, not all of them, many of them were dictatorships as well, but were either oligarchs who voted themselves to go fight or quasi-democracies who voted themselves to go fight. So it turns out, weirdly, that humans seem perfectly willing to vote themselves or to encourage themselves to go on military adventures of, often quite dubious nature. So yeah, it would be nice to think that all volunteer armies, people wouldn't vote themselves into war, but it turns out that's not true. In any case, it does raise the question again, is, okay, if it's a conscript army or a draft army, again, as we're seeing with Russia and the Ukraine, does this make a huge ethical difference? Is it okay to force people to fight against their will? Notice that to be basically impressed into having to go and fight a war. Wow. But by the way, this is dead standard throughout much of history. I mean, the United States has a draft in theory. We haven't used it for a long time, but not that long of a time since the Vietnam War. But, is that okay, right? If your nation decides it's okay, can you then say, well, then we can draft people, even people who don't want to fight? Could I have been drafted to go fight in Afghanistan, even though I was amongst the apparently vanishingly small number of people who thought this was a bad idea? In theory, yes. And then you're in the ethical position of saying, oh, well, do I resist this? Do I fight back? Do I leave the country? What does one do? Versus, what are the ethics of having an all-volunteer army? Right? Does that change the equation where you go, yeah, it seems to, in the United States, that we seem slightly more indifferent to the wars that we're in a way, because our army is volunteer and we don't feel like, we're like, well, they volunteered. So they've, if the government sends them someplace to fight, they volunteered to go there and fight and do what the government said. So it seems to create this different feeling about wars and military adventures than when you have a drafted or a conscripted army and you're like, hey, there better be big communal support for this because these people did not volunteer. I mean, there was a draft in World War II. We always think, oh, World War II, everyone must have shown up and volunteered to go fight. A lot of people did, but a lot of people are just flat out drafted. Is that okay? Right? Does that, you mean the fact that we had a very clear, very aggressive and dangerous enemy, does that make it okay to force people to go over there and fight? Or should it be a situation where you go, oh, this is such a clear and dangerous enemy, we probably will get plenty of recruits. Generally speaking, when push comes to shove, governments of all kinds go, no, we're gonna just force people to fight because given their druthers, they would rather not do that. So then there's the whole, what are the ethics around conscription versus volunteer armies? And what are the ethics around attack and defense? Oh, this one seems clear at first. Again, I'll just keep using the Russian-Ukraine model because that's what, prompted me to ponder the ethics of war in this very direct way. Again, not that I've been thinking about it for quite some time, but, if someone invades your neighborhood, your house, your country, your state, does this create a very different ethical structure? Now, if you're a legalist, yes, you're like, wow, someone invades your country, you have every legal right to fight, so go ahead. If you're a pacifist, not so much. It's like, yeah, you're not supposed to do that. If you're the Athenian power model, it's like, yeah, you fight as best you can because that's what it's about. And if you can win, well, then you just press down on them because that's what the strong do to the weak. And if you lose, well, too bad for you. This is, again, the sort of just pure power model of what's happening. And but ethically, it does feel quite different. It does look like, oh, you know what? We're not bothering anybody. We're over here. We're hanging out. And a foreign power comes rolling across the border to conquer us is a very different experience than going, okay, we have to pack up and go someplace else to get them. This, by the way, was one of the things that seemed mad to me about sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the Middle East and Afghanistan, because relatively speaking, it's somewhat difficult to get to the United States from the Middle East, particularly after 9/11, when, of course, security just went through the roof. However, if we send people over there, it's just very much more convenient for killing them. It just seems like a bad strategic move because, they're several thousand miles closer and in dangerous places where it's much easier to kill them. And, of course, so unfortunately, many people were killed on both sides. But that sort of notion of going, oh, when is it a defense? When it is an attack? But then, of course, this gets blurry, right? If someone attacks you from far away, when do you get to say, okay, now you've attacked me directly enough? Is it when, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and the United States is, okay, even though Pearl Harbor Hawaii wasn't a state yet, but they said, okay, that's a direct attack on American forces. Now we're at war, right? That's close enough. Hawaii is part of our territory, so here we go. But Hawaii had done a lot of Japan had done a lot of other stuff. And we're like, well, no, I know they've been threatening, they had said things, but, now we've got a clear casus belli, and we're ready to go. And that does seem quite different. And it is different because the population went from being relatively isolationist and pretty much trying to stay out of the war, which is why America enters World War II so late, to overnight, like, we're ready, let's go. And it just galvanized opinion just overnight. And so that sort of impact versus going to Vietnam, another American war seemed such a reach. Like, people were always dubious about this. I mean, it became increasingly unpopular over time, but even political figures were like, ooh, it's a very different kind of battle when you have to, how do you make the threat clear? And that's where you get, the domino theory that if Vietnam falls, then I don't know, something else falls and eventually California falls. I was never quite clear on exactly what that theory was. It was a notion that, well, communism is going to march across the Pacific and then America will be threatened, so we'd better stop it in Vietnam, which really seemed quite a reach at the time. And historically, of course, turned out to be quite a reach. So, but that sort of distinction between who's attacking and who's defending, I think is really important to keep in mind, and why. And then where do you draw those lines? I mean, this was the appeasement of Hitler in World War II was all about this. Like, well, they haven't attacked England yet. They haven't attacked France yet. So when do we, how much are we willing to let them take before we say, okay, no. Now that's really it. Even though in England it was very close. I mean, it was a very close run, both in the cabinet and in parliament and even amongst the population. It's like, ooh, it wasn't a 90-10 kind of thing. It was much closer than that, going, well, the empire hasn't really been attacked. We're worried about Japan, Hitler, maybe we can negotiate, how much when is it actually threatening to us, even if someone hasn't invaded England itself, and so those sorts of often clear-cut situations have many median situations where you go, ooh, like, is this count? How about this? How about this? And if you go through history, you realize, like, the kind of clarity that we want is often lacking, right? That it's really nice to have, again, as we're experiencing with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, wow, it's so much clearer than most of history, right? It's just really, this is clearly an internationally illegal act being perpetrated by, a despotic leader with, drafted and conscripted soldiers who don't want to be there, who are doing, horrible things and committing war crimes left and right. So in this way, you get really amazing clarity. And of course, that kind of clarity is unified dramatically Europe and much of the world. However, most of the history of warfare is, it's much murkier than that. I mean, this is why civil wars are always so challenging, because wars are usually supposed to be fought, again, by international rules between states. But what happens when a state turns on itself? And how do you decide who are the actors who should be recognized as legitimate actors when you have a civil war? Again, the American Civil War, classic example, but there are civil wars going on now in the world, and the history of civil wars are often the most brutal kind of wars, because many of the rules and much of the clarity that you would hope for goes away, because the borders, you're fighting within the borders rather than to defend them. The legal and governing structures are breaking down by definition. The kind of things that organize and maybe contain the violence and other circumstances simply vanish. And so when you think of, wars of independence and civil wars and these sorts of things, very quickly the kind of clarity that we might like to have, that like, oh, here's a clear victim of a clearly evil assault, is rare and in some ways ethically easier to process than the very much more subtle and complex problems that the history of warfare presents us with. And so when we stop to reflect on these issues, I think, as with any ethical issue, kind of step one is to say, where are your own core values, right? Where's, what to you stands out foremost amongst your values, and then how does that in any way map onto the situation in which the individual, your country, yourself, or your world finds itself. And this is what, people are struggling with this in the Ukraine, because it seems such a clear example of evil and strong attacking weak and good, that it's like, oh, perhaps we should do more. But if the world does more, if NATO, whatever, puts a no-fly zone in or whatnot, well, then does that widen the war? Does widening the war help or to hurt? Is more war better than less war? these, it gets really vexed very quickly. Of course, this is why there's, whole colleges dedicated to studying these sorts of issues, war colleges and centers for strategic studies and all this, trying to figure out like, oh, where are the ethics, what's strategically best. But when you have a chance of widening a war or containing it, which is better ethically? I don't know. I mean, these are really quite difficult things to judge, particularly when, as again, we're witnessing very clearly in the Russian-Ukraine war, and as essentially every war historian always says, you never know what's going to happen. Like once you start, what's going to happen is almost completely unforeseeable because it's so complicated. There's so many psychological, international, local factors at play that, it's virtually unpredictable. I mean, you just over and over and over again, you see throughout history, there's just incredible variability of war. And so the easy Russian victory march into Kiev in 2 days is not manifested itself and doesn't seem likely to manifest itself anytime soon. A horrible and gross miscalculation. But how do you respond to that when you don't know what that response will generate? Ooh, right? This is the fear of the unknown. Where is the ethical imperative that says embrace these incredible unknowns? Yeah, difficult times, difficult things to think about. But if you reflect on your own ethos, if you reflect on like what are your core values, and then again map them onto different situations, not just the one that we're facing today, but others, you can start going, oh, okay, yeah, this would be what I would be willing to fight for. This seems like it's willing to actually bomb and kill people under these circumstances, but not any others. And if you can sort of get that own clarity for yourself, then that sometimes, although not always, but sometimes help then to reflect upon what's happening in your situation. But it's also important to remember to go all the way back to where I started from, that it is we are members of large structures that we do not control, right? We're floating along in history. We have the history that we're given. We can influence some things in some ways, but we can influence a lot in a lot of ways. And so I think this is one of the real tensions that war produces, is a very strong sense of ethical and outrage and feeling for everyone who's involved in this horrible destruction, and the ability to translate our own sensibilities into empathy for the victims and imagining how horrible it would be to happen to us, and realizing it in some ways that if it can happen in the Ukraine, it can happen anywhere. And so just sort of that terrible sensibility, it tends to engender a sense of powerlessness, because these are systems over which we have little or no influence. Again, by definition, this is not that's what war is. War is these large-scale social interactions that do not respond necessarily well to the wills of individuals. Even, and this is sort of odd to think about, the war in the Ukraine, because this was started in essence by one person, Vladimir Putin. And even he, having started the war, clearly is not able to make it go the way he wants. So the single person who has the most influence over this war is Vladimir Putin, and he clearly cannot control what's happening. That is the strange nature of warfare. It unleashes powers which are extraordinarily difficult to marshal and control, even for individuals like Putin, who has more direct control than pretty much, I don't know in history who would have had more than he has. And yet still, he is not able to impose his will as he thought he would be able to. And this is the vexatious nature of war for individuals like ourselves, who would just prefer peace, and we would like this not to be happening. And yet the structures are such that we can have limited, little impact. And thinking about, how do we respond in situations like this? And I go back to one of the writers I really like, Hermann Hesse, And he was, of course, suffered through World War I and World War II. He was that German generation that was born into a very difficult time in history, to say the least. And his works were banned, and he fled Germany and was living abroad, living in Switzerland, I believe, with his wife Nannerl, who was Jewish, and so her family is being killed, and it's just horrible in every way. And someone wrote him a letter because he had published a review of a German poet, and they said, what are you doing? Why are you writing reviews of minor German poets when this time is so horrible? It's like, the world is burning down, and here you are writing reviews of poets who no one's going to read because the German language has been destroyed, and, all this awful things is happening. And Hesse wrote back and he said, I'm aware of the awfulness of the war. His entire life work is sort of being burnt down before his eyes. His work's banned, the whole thing, right? His wife's family being killed, his family being threatened and dying in the fields, right? It's just, and he said, but what do you do? He says, I look at the field of flowers outside my windows and they're blooming. Tomorrow a panzer may roll across, destroy them all, destroy my home, and kill me and my family. I paraphrase. But today they bloom because that's what flowers do. Flowers bloom. I'm going to write reviews of German writers because I'm a German writer, and I believe in literature, and I believe in the power of civilization. And so I'm going to do what I can to keep that civilization going, even in the face of clearly just darkness, destruction, terror of the largest magnitude. And I've always kind of taken that to heart because, he didn't want to kill people, and he wasn't in a position, he was an older gentleman at this time, wasn't in a position to sort of affect world affairs. But he thought, no, I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to keep the literature, the civilization, the beauty, the power, the intellect alive, and try to nurture those things that I think are being destroyed. At precisely the same time, or at a similar time in the United States, where Thomas Mann was sort of exiled to Pasadena, I guess you would say, he was writing a novel and doing much the same kind of work. And in his novel, Dr. Faustus, he has a character, I think Professor Zeitblom, I think that's the name of the main character, who's narrating a biography of his friend, in theory, who is recounting the destruction of his whole world. And it's incredibly painful to read this novel because Thomas Mann is sitting there watching his world be destroyed, and he's writing a narrator who's sitting in Germany watching his world be destroyed. And he doesn't know where his children are, who are off fighting in the war, which is true both for Thomas Mann and for his narrator in the novel. And so he's taking this most difficult and, awful period with his, he doesn't know if his sons are alive or dead. He doesn't know, what's going to happen. Germany is dead. Everything has been destroyed. His house has been burnt down. And he's sitting there, and what does he decide to do? He's like, one, make art, make literature, try to process this, try to produce something good out of it, try to help other writers, try to help intellectuals, try to help refugees, doing what he can to keep the good things of his world alive. And so when we think about the challenges and ethics around war, perhaps one could even argue there are no ethics of war, but I think the legalist argument says, no, we can do this. We can impose at least some ethics on war. It is important to remember again that there's this impersonal nature, that we don't control a lot of these forces, but it doesn't mean that we're powerless. That doesn't mean that we can't reflect on our own values and go, this is what's important to me. This is what is being destroyed. This is what I think I can build or rebuild or try and grow and make stronger. And so when we see things being destroyed, when we see a world being bombed, when we see devastation, one possible response, and one certainly ethically viable response, is to say, well, what can I build? What can I create, a la Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse? What can I do to make the world better, to in some ways at least a little bit offset the thing that's making it worse? And one tiny note on this that I thought was quite beautiful is the refugees are arriving in all over Europe, of course, but Poland in particular is taking in a lot of the Ukrainian refugees. And on the train station, and I believe it was in Poland, it could be a different country, but I'm pretty sure it was in Poland, some people had gathered a bunch of flowers. And then as these refugees who are hungry and tired and cold and afraid are coming off the train, they're just handing them these little bouquets of flowers. And I thought, oh my, and then the look on the face of the people arriving was just amazing. And I thought, yeah, you're cold and hungry and afraid, and somehow a flower, the beautiful symbol of, hope, that there is joy in the world, that there is beauty in the world, that you can survive, that you believe in all of this goodness, was just encapsulated in that moment. And those flowers don't stop the war, and they don't keep people from being killed, and they don't, punish Putin for this horrible war that he started. But nonetheless, it does in some way quite powerfully and profoundly say, hey, there is hope, civilization still exists, and there's still beauty in the world. And in some ways, that's just a very powerful and vibrant response to circumstances that by definition, most individuals have very little sway over. So just some reflections and thoughts, and maybe some ways to enter into pondering the, vast and difficult world of thinking about the ethics of war. Thank you.